Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to be taking a look at the dungeons in Destiny 2. I'm going to be ranking them in a tier list. You guys have seen tier lists like these probably plenty of times. However, I've been on quite a big dungeon kick lately, and I really wanted to share my thoughts on the dungeons as a whole. I've been going back and playing through all of the dungeons, trying to solo them, which I've soloed all the dungeons up to this point, and I've solo flawlessed the Duality Dungeon, which is the most recent dungeon. I really enjoy that one quite a bit. And because I've been on such a kick with the dungeons for whatever reason lately, I just wanted to go ahead and share my thoughts on them, so let's just go ahead and hop right in. Starting with Shattered Throne, the first dungeon, the surprise dungeon that released shortly after Forsaken's launch. I believe it may be released after the raid was completed in Forsaken. And things like that really are what solidified Forsaken as a amazing campaign. There were amazing expansion, I should say. There were things like the Shattered Throne that just kept coming out. Like every week there was something new, and Shattered Throne was one of the biggest things that came out and surprised us, and it was huge, and it was a good dungeon. But comparing it to the rest of the dungeons on this list, I think it maybe doesn't reach the quality of the other ones, some of them, not all of them. But hopping right into the beginning encounter, I believe it's called the Labyrinth. It's a very cool encounter the first couple times maybe, but it starts to drag when you repeat this dungeon quite a bit. It's a very drawn out, a little bit long-winded encounter. And it's definitely probably the easiest part of the dungeon. It's not necessarily super difficult. It's just, again, a little bit slow. Not good for replayability in my opinion. The next encounter is pretty much just a long running section known as the Descent. It's a pretty drawn out area as well. You gotta navigate quite a bit of this realm, killing plenty of high value enemies, a lot of ogres on like the balance beams up high, and it all looks great. The aesthetics of this dungeon are fantastic. The encounter itself also just a little bit drawn out. Not my favorite to replay necessarily. But now getting to the first boss, Vorgeth, I believe his name is. Vorgeth is a pretty cool fight in concept, I guess. He's just a little easy, and I don't know if it is something about the Shattered Throne dungeons in general, or the dungeon in general, compared to the others, where the bosses have a very small health pool, and it's really not hard to one-phase them. Both the final boss and Vorgeth himself. And it kind of has a standard mechanic to it where it's collect something and dunk something. It's not super unique in that regard. I think Vorgeth is probably one of the weaker dungeon bosses overall. And then the next section you have another kind of jumping / traveling portion of the dungeon known as the Climb, where you make your way up to Duality Dungeon. And it's just another, I can live with it encounter, but it's not great after playing the dungeon a few times. Now, Duality Dungeon, like I said, has a pretty low health pool. However, in order to damage her, you need to kill knights. The more knights you kill, the more stacks of the damage buff increase you get. Not a super complex thing mechanically. Dungeons aren't necessarily raid level complex when it comes to mechanics, but I would say it's a little simple. Not special in that regard. Very cool looking boss. Love the lore of the area. The final boss room is pretty cool. And again, at the time, I think that it definitely made a better impression than how it's aged, in my opinion. I think it's probably aged the most out of all the dungeons. The loot from this dungeon was not entirely unique either. It doesn't have its own armor set or weapon set. They all kind of came from just the Dreaming City in general. There wasn't any dedicated loot pool for the dungeon. Now, with all that being said, I think that the Shattered Throne is a pretty alright dungeon, just not something that held up as well compared to these other dungeons. And for that, we're gonna throw it in the B tier, because it is very cool. It's a very fun dungeon, especially the first few times through. But I'm gonna probably stick with the B tier just because it was the first dungeon. It was our first look at what a dungeon could be, and I think Bungie has improved for the most part on the dungeons since Shattered Throne, at least a little bit, because now we're moving on to another dungeon, which was the second dungeon released, and that was during Shadowkeep, and that dungeon is Pit of Heresy. Pit of Heresy, I personally do not love Pit of Heresy. I think it's also a dungeon that drags very much. The first encounter of Pit of Heresy is very much like the first encounter in the Shattered Throne dungeon, where you're looking for symbols and you're using the blades of Crota, or the sword blades, to take down various enemies in different ways. And it's a very vast area and a lot of ground to cover if you have your symbols super spread apart and things like that. It's a very kind of boring opening section to the dungeon. The second encounter is also not a very fun encounter in my opinion. The need to kind of hide from these ogres is kind of cool in concept. It's just not that fun necessarily, because the ogre can melt you pretty quick. You just have to kind of run around in these hidey holes and kill Thrall and a knight, and then do something not unique like dunk a ball somewhere. You got to do that in 3 separate areas. It's just kind of a let's get through this encounter type of encounter. It's not very fun necessarily, especially on repeat playthroughs. The third encounter, I actually like this one quite a bit. It reminds me of the totem encounter from King's Fall. It can get pretty hectic in there, especially trying to solo the dungeon, and it offers a legitimate challenge. It's not entirely too difficult or anything like that, but it's a nice change of pace from the very kind of boring, not action-heavy encounters in the beginning of the dungeon. And then we've got another encounter, which is again just kind of drawn out, not very exciting in my opinion. You have to navigate this kind of maze-like jumping puzzle area to find these wizards to take down. And I admit I'm definitely not perfect at navigating this place, so it's a little bit frustrating sometimes when you think you're about to run into an enemy because you're seeing red on the radar, but then you just run into a wall and realize you have to jump back around a few times to get to the right place. And that's fine. That's probably on me for not knowing the encounter super well, but I don't really have a desire to memorize that place. It's just one of those let's get through it encounters for me. And now let's talk about the final boss, probably the biggest highlight of the Pit of Heresy dungeon, Zolmak. He's definitely a lot more high action than the rest of the dungeon, which has been very slow up to this point. It can get pretty intense with the Cursed Thrall inside the damage aura that you have to fight him within. He looks fucking cool. He's like Crota, but like flame version, kind of like the Flame Prince from the Prison of Elders in Destiny 1. It's just a lot more intense, it's a lot more engaging, very fun fight. And every time I finish this dungeon, I'm just like, man, I wish the rest of the dungeon could have this same level of intensity. The totem encounter is really the only place where you get some intensity throughout the dungeon besides this final boss. And I think that as an overall experience, I'd say that Pit of Heresy is probably my least favorite dungeon. While there are some step-ups from Shattered Throne in some regards, I think it's the one I like to play the least. I will gladly go through Shattered Throne. This one takes me a little bit more convincing to run through this one if someone wants to do it. There is a secret boss fight in this dungeon. I almost forgot about that part. Xenophage, the Xenophage questline involving that secret boss fight. That was very, very cool. To have like a off to the side boss fight that requires pretty different mechanics in their own regard, where you have to defeat enemies with specific elements, so you kind of have to match your team up with weapons that are different from each other, have different elements in order to damage the boss there. That's a pretty cool fight, actually. I wish there was something like that somewhere else in the game. I think it's pretty unique. I'd say overall the weapons from the dungeon were not too great. I never really cared for much of them. I think Xenophage is probably the only good thing to come out of Pit of Heresy loot-wise. And Xenophage, I love Xenophage. I use it all the time. It's a very easy weapon. It's very versatile. Overall, though, as a regular dungeon, not including things like the Xenophage questline, I think that I would probably have to stick this one in C tier. It's just probably the one I want to play the least. And I like playing dungeons for fun. I go through and play them even if I've already completed them on that character, if I'm in the mood for it. I just like doing dungeons, but this one, I definitely kind of stay away from this one. It's not that fun to me. Now we are moving on to a great dungeon, and that is the Prophecy Dungeon. The intro is not as long-winded as the other two, which I really appreciate. However, it still does teach you the main mechanic that you're going to be doing throughout the whole dungeon, and it does it pretty quickly. And right after the entrance, the intro to the dungeon, you're already thrown into your first boss fight, which is pretty cool. It's kind of like straight away you're into the action, and I really like that aspect. You can kind of get into the fun parts of the dungeon right away. And this is the Phalanx Echo, the Taken Phalanx, the worst type of enemy in the world. Trying to solo flawless this one is very difficult because of the shield bash, not bash, but like kind of explosion he does. Oh my goodness, it's so frustrating to try and stay on sometimes in this fight, because that guy, if you just, you know, aren't careful, he will knock you off the small arena that is the first boss. But I really like this fight. It's super hectic. You can get very overwhelmed by ads if you're not careful. Mechanically, very simple. It's just a matter of staying alive in a very hectic environment, hectic, small arena. I would say it's probably the strongest start to any dungeon in Destiny 2. Then we move on to the Wasteland, which is a very cool area. When you pull out your ghost here, it says heaven/hell, which is very cool. You don't really know where you are. It's like this sandy, like almost like Mars, but it's white sand. It just is very, very cool. You don't know what's going on in this area. I still don't quite know the story behind Prophecy. I'll probably have to look that up, but it looks great. It's very cool, and we get to ride our sparrow around. The encounter itself, it's just killing blights, nothing too deep or crazy. Then we are moving on to the next encounter known as the Cube encounter, which is kind of a cool encounter if you really think about it. The way that the room kind of shifts around and turns around, and it actually does the same thing in the final fight as well. But I think that this one may drag on just one or two phases a little too long, but for the most part, I don't really have a problem with it. It's a pretty fun one. And it's actually not as long as some of the other drawn out encounters from different dungeons. So I don't really mind this one too much, but I know some people have a problem with this encounter. I think it's fine. You get to fight 2 mini bosses at the end, and that's pretty cool too. They die super quick though. They're not even a challenge. And then we move on to probably one of the coolest things in any dungeon, and that is the Rainbow Road of Dungeon, Sparrow Racing, whatever. It's very cool, this whole entire area. You're riding around on like these big red kind of ribbons, pretty much. Again, I don't understand necessarily what this entire place is, but it looks cool and it's fun to play. So for whatever reason, like the story is behind any of this stuff, like riding our sparrows on ribbon, like I don't understand that, but it's very cool. Anytime we get to ride our sparrows around, especially on something like a track like this, is very fun. It's a pretty fun, casual, relaxing way to segue into the final boss. And the final boss fight is really good. I think that the Kel Echo boss fight is one of the best boss fights we've had in Destiny. I guess it's not raid level amazing, but it's very fun. It's challenging. And obviously we're still doing the pretty much same kind of mechanical thing we've been doing the whole time with banking light and dark modes. But I think this is the best place that mechanic really shines. This is another room where you can get overwhelmed super easy. Getting up to damage phase can sometimes take a second unless you're very quick. Obviously, I've been playing a lot of solo recently, so this is one of the ones that takes a minute to get into the damage phase. Not the longest. I would say that's probably in the next dungeon we're going to talk about for the final boss. But this is still quite a process to get up to the damage phase. The Kel Echo has a ton of health. It's a pretty long fight. I like the whole dark entropy mechanic where you have to stay within the ring that's kind of close to him in order to stay alive. And the hobgoblins are constantly trying to take you out, and those are always a pain in the ass. But if you get pretty consistent at clearing the room, it's not super difficult. I think that overall though, this entire dungeon experience is one of the best. It's pretty much high action or just fun throughout the entire dungeon from start to finish. It also has some great looking armor sets across all the characters, and some of the weapons were also pretty top tier, those being the Year 1 Trials of the 9 weapons. The pulse rifle I remember specifically liking quite a bit. I think that this dungeon deserves to be in the A tier. Definitely a very replayable dungeon. I'm always down to run a Prophecy. It's a very fun dungeon. Now let's talk about the next dungeon. The Grasp of Avarice Dungeon from the 30th Anniversary Pack. This dungeon is obviously a much more lighthearted and kind of fun dungeon. A little goofy in a lot of ways. I mean, it is the loot cave dungeon where you're picking up engrams to bank into these crystals. It's kind of got a lighthearted tone to it. It's got a lot of traps and kind of troll-like elements to it, which is fun with friends. And you get to explore a lot of cool places in the Cosmodrome, and it's just a great location overall, the places you traverse. A lot of the intro and probably the first 2 or 3 encounters are mostly just jumping puzzles in a way, or just making your way through an area. And so I wouldn't say it has the strongest start by any means, especially replayability wise, but it's not too long when you finally make it to the boss, the first boss, who is sitting inside of Sepix Prime's room for whatever reason, and that's where you take him down, and he's a big old ogre. And the mechanics, you gotta bank your engrams and the crystals, and you gotta use a scorch cannon to open things. I think it's a fun mechanic. It's not complex or any way like that, but it's fun. It's, you gotta move around a lot. The ogre boss has quite a bit of health. I'm not gonna lie, this guy is tanky, and honestly, both bosses in this dungeon are pretty tanky sons of bitches, dude. They take forever, especially soloing these dungeons. It takes just a little bit longer because of the health pool that these guys have. The next encounter is definitely a highlight, especially the first few times through with your friends. It's like we're always teased with Sparrow Racing by Bungie. Like, we get these moments in raids or dungeons or something like this where we're able to do something fast-paced on a Sparrow, and it's just a lot of fun. It reminded me a lot of the Scourge of the Past raid, when you have that Sparrow section where you got to be really quick and you got to diffuse things. It has the same diffusing mechanics. And yeah, this is a very fun encounter. And after you learn it, it's not hard, but still it's always a good time to run back through stuff on your Sparrow and kind of race each other and stuff like that. It was a great middle section of the dungeon. Definitely one of the highlights of the Grasp of Avarice. And then we come to an encounter that I don't really enjoy that much. It's one of those drawn out encounters, like, let's get through it. It's not like it's a bad encounter. It's kind of cool. Like, the idea of having to destroy these servitors, to shoot them through a cannon at this shield. It's just, I don't know. It just sometimes, like, if your RNG is bad and your servitor keeps spawning across the map, it can get a little, annoying. But it's not a bad encounter by any means. Just a little long. Now we've got Captain Avarice the Covetous, the final boss. This guy is pretty cool, super goddamn tanky. The shank in the middle that respawns after each damage phase is a pain in the ass. You gotta waste so much ammo on that guy to kill him. I always kill him because that dude hits like a truck with his sniper. So especially when I solo this, that guy is really annoying to deal with, just because you have to take him out in order to, ensure your success so you don't die in a damage phase. Like I said, this boss has a ton of health, just a little bit time consuming of a fight, but not really challenging necessarily. It's a fun little ending to the dungeon. I think that the Grasp of Avarice dungeon overall is an enjoyable experience, but I don't think stands out mechanically or thematically as much as Prophecy or even Duality. So it's a fun little distraction of a dungeon. Not my favorite in the world, but definitely more replayable than Pit of Heresy and even Shattered Throne for me, so we're going to throw that in the B tier. Oh, and how can I forget about the loot in Grasp of Avarice, man? We got the Gallahorn, we got the Ias Luna, the Matador, the 1,000-Yard Stare, a lot of Destiny 1 weapons, all pretty good, especially the Gallahorn. It's top tier in this game, it's insane. Grasp of Avarice loot is incredible. The armor looks really good as well. I love the look of it on all the characters. But now we are on the final dungeon that has been released as of now in August 2022. And it is the Duality Dungeon. I love this dungeon. I'm not going to lie, guys. This is definitely my personal favorite dungeon. It has by far the best mechanics of any dungeon we've got so far. The boss fights are the most enjoyable in my opinion. And despite sticking to very similar mechanics throughout, they are varied enough so they're not exactly the same. Whereas, let's say Prophecy, as much as I love that dungeon, you bank your your moats in the same way on the same type of areas, but this one is a bit more varied in how it deals with similar mechanics throughout the entire dungeon. Now this one, I would say that the beginning is not as strong as something like Prophecy. It's another one of those kind of longer intros where you got to run and jump through a lot of different areas and going back and forth between the Nightmare Realm and the Real World Realm. And it's fun. It's not super drawn out. I don't mind it, actually. But it's not as exciting as something like the Prophecy intro, where it's kind of like straight into the action. But it's not long before we get to the Sorrow Bearer, Mr. Galron himself. The Nightmare of Galron, I should say, since Galron is no longer in the game. Rest in peace, Crown of Sorrow, I miss you. This encounter is a lot of fun. It actually is very unique and has more mechanics than anything we've seen in dungeons before, where you kind of need to split up and open doors and clear out waves of mini bosses in order to get to a damage phase. It's probably the most unique of all the dungeon mechanics. It was definitely surprising to see these types of mechanics right off the bat. A little bit more complex, nothing crazy, but something I personally like to see in a dungeon. I like when they increase the challenge a little bit. I will say that this fight is probably the place where I had the most physics-based issues, like getting hit into a wall and dying, things like that. It was so frustrating trying to solo flawless this thing. Thankfully I was able to do it finally, but when I was trying to solo flawless this dungeon initially, I was dying to the architects way more than I should have been, in my opinion. This fight was particularly annoying in that regard. But I think the fight itself is really good. There's a lot of moving parts to it. You got to make sure you take care of the bell keepers and things like that on top of the other mechanics you already have. You have a limited time window to make sure that you end the damage phase before you die pretty much. It's a great first boss of the dungeon. Next up, we have a jumping puzzle that's much more reminiscent of a raid jumping puzzle in my opinion. It's a little bit more, complex, I guess, as a jumping puzzle than other jumping puzzles in dungeons that have come before. It feels like a mini raid. I think that overall Duality feels much more like a raid, which is why I love it so much. It has much more challenge to it, and it's kind of in a raid-like space too. It feels like very big, very open. Like you travel quite a distance in this dungeon. There's kind of a random encounter that seems very pointless and exists kind of just to waste your time, where there's these statues that you need to push buttons on in order to unlock this vault door. The thing is that these statues don't have like random locations in which they spawn in. They're always the same statues in the same order. Like it's not like they randomly spawn in different like locations per run of the dungeon, which is kind of weird to me. It seems like it would have made more sense if that's what happened, but no, it's the exact same statues that are in the same positions when you get into the room. It's kind of a weird thing to me. But after that, you get to another encounter that involves killing 3 mini bosses that takes a bit of work to get up to the point where you can damage the mini boss. And it all happens in the Nightmare Realm, where you need to clear out a lot of enemies and a Colossus and then a Standard Bearer to get the symbol to bank it back in the real world. And it can be kind of challenging if you're not efficient at killing enemies quickly. Like you can run out of time fairly quickly if you're not on top of things. This one, day one, when me and my friends were doing it, this was the encounter that we got held up on. We were a little bit under leveled, so that made it definitely pretty challenging. But we were hung up on this encounter initially, going in blind for the first time. It was definitely pretty difficult, especially early on. But I've grown to really like this encounter. It's very fun. You got to be efficient. I've got this thing down to a science now after solo flawlessing this thing, because, man, after you fail it so many times in your attempts, you start to just become an expert at doing certain things over and over again, I guess. Definitely one of the longer encounters of the dungeon, but I quite like it. Again, very challenging. Then there's a little bit of a jumping puzzle ahead again, just to get to the final boss, and it is Keitel, the daughter of Callus, the nightmare version of her, of course. And this fight is so good. I love the Keitel fights. This is definitely my favorite part of the entire dungeon. It blends all of the challenging parts from before with some new twists, with Keitel being able to end a damage phase instantaneously as soon as you get in there if you're not careful. Anyways, going through it, when you get to the Keitel phase of the boss fight, after you've gathered your symbols from the Nightmare Realm, Keitel just mad sprints at one of the bells. Now the best thing you can do, especially if you're solo, as soon as you spawn in, kill the 2 in the middle as fast as possible, see where she's going, run right up to her, grab her attention by making her force a slam down on you, kill the other 2, in whichever direction she's going, and just go from there. You definitely got to be on top of your game here, especially if you're solo. The challenge that this fight brings is extremely fun, in my opinion. Very much like a raid boss in a lot of ways. I think honestly this fight could exist in a raid as a raid boss. It is that good, that well of a designed fight in my opinion. The loot from Duality is probably some of the best in all of the dungeons. I mean, you got Storm Chaser, which is just incredible right now for DPS. You've got the fixed odds machine gun, I believe it's called. That thing is pretty good if you get a certain, set of perks. The Unforgiven SMG, I personally really like that right now with Rampage on it. It feels very good. The pulse rifle's good. The grenade launcher is pretty good too, actually, if you get a good set of perks on it. The armor is just okay to me. It's fine. It looks fine, but it's not anything I'd probably wear myself. It looks okay though. But definitely, if you're doing this dungeon, it's for the weapons. Some of them are really top tier. The Heart Shadow I recently got just a few days ago. Haven't used it yet. I've heard good things. I've heard negative things. I don't really know. I'd have to test it myself. But if you guys can't already tell, I think that Duality is definitely an S tier dungeon. This is by far Bungie's best dungeon. It is just a great experience. Very challenging, but very, very replayable in my opinion. But that's going to be it for my list of my tier list, I should say, of the dungeons in Destiny 2. Let me know what you guys think in the comment sections down below. Do you agree or disagree with my ranking? Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video if you enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one.